In Savannah's moss-draped Victorian District, a determined young woman was about to discover the true cost of family loyalty. What started as a simple homecoming took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her own brother lounging in her violated sanctuary. Magnolia Beauregard wasn't your typical Southern daughter. For 6 transformative months, she had spent her life studying Maori healing traditions in New Zealand, known for her fierce independence wrapped in careful politeness. When she encountered Jasper's brazen occupation of her apartment, she had no idea she was walking into a web of manipulation that stretched back generations. Magnolia's fight to reclaim her space would lead to the unraveling of her family's carefully constructed lies. What began as a property dispute would become a reckoning with Southern family expectations and the courage required to break free from toxic traditions. The Beauregard family would never be the same after one woman chose truth over comfortable denial. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humid Georgia air hit Magnolia like a physical weight as she stepped out of Savannah Hilton Head International Airport, her duffel bag heavy with hand-woven Maori textiles and carved wooden art therapy tools. 6 months in New Zealand's crisp Wellington air had made her forget the oppressive embrace of a southern summer, how it wrapped around you like wet wool, demanding submission to its languid pace. The taxi driver loaded her bags with practiced efficiency, his movements slow and deliberate in the heat. "Where to, miss?" "Bull Street, please. The Victorian District." The words felt foreign on her tongue after months of speaking in whispers around sacred Maori sites and laughing with her fellowship cohort in coffee shops overlooking Wellington Harbor. Everything here seemed simultaneously too familiar and completely changed. As they drove through downtown Savannah, Spanish moss draped the live oaks like familiar curtains, and the antebellum architecture stood as proud and immutable as ever. But Magnolia felt different, expanded somehow, as if the 6 months had stretched her soul beyond the boundaries she'd always accepted. The art therapy techniques she'd learned from the Maori healers had shown her how creativity could unlock trauma, how tradition could heal rather than confine. "First time back in Savannah?" the driver asked, catching her wonder in the rearview mirror. "Returning home," she said, though the word home felt complex now. Her Bull Street apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was her declaration of independence, the first space that belonged entirely to her. She'd spent 2 years scraping together the deposit for that converted carriage house behind the historic mansion. Every dollar a small rebellion against her family's expectation that she'd remain forever under their protective wing. The taxi turned onto Bull Street, and Magnolia's heart quickened. There was her building, the grand 1870s mansion standing like a sentinel with her little carriage house tucked behind it. The jasmine was blooming, filling the air with sweetness that made her eyes water. Or maybe that was just the emotion of finally being back. "Keep the change," she told the driver, overpaying in her eagerness to touch her own front door, to sink into her vintage velvet sofa and sort through the treasures she'd brought back from across the world. The key still fit perfectly in the lock, and she pushed open the door with a smile on her face that died instantly. Gaming controllers scattered across her coffee table. Empty beer bottles lined up on her kitchen counter like soldiers. A PlayStation setup dominated the corner where her easel used to stand, cables snaking across the hardwood floor she'd spent a weekend refinishing herself. And there, sprawled across her carefully chosen vintage sofa like a conquering king, was her younger brother Jasper. "Well, well," he drawled, not even looking up from his screen where animated soldiers were shooting at each other. "Look what the cat dragged in." Magnolia stood frozen in her own doorway, bags still in hand. "Jasper, what are you doing here?" "Living," he said simply, finally pausing his game and turning to face her with that smile that had charmed teachers, professors, and family members his entire life. At 23, he still had the golden boy looks that made people want to forgive him everything. Sandy hair that fell just right, green eyes that sparkled with mischief, and the kind of easy confidence that came from never truly facing consequences. "In my apartment." "Our apartment," he corrected, stretching his arms above his head as if he owned the place. "Family takes care of family, Maggie. Thought you would have learned that by now." The casual use of her childhood nickname felt like a slap. In New Zealand, she'd been Magnolia, the full weight and beauty of her name respected. Here, she was immediately diminished back to little sister. "This is my apartment, Jasper. I pay the rent. My name is on the lease." He finally stood, and she noticed he'd gained weight. Not healthy weight, but the soft pudginess that came from too much takeout and too little accountability. "See, that's where you're wrong, sis. While you were off playing tourist in New Zealand, real life was happening here. Meemaw had her stroke, and somebody had to step up." The words hit her like cold water. "What stroke? When?" "6 weeks ago." His voice carried practiced hurt, the tone of someone who'd told this story before, to maximum effect. "Guess you were too busy finding yourself to check in with your actual family." Magnolia's mind raced through their recent video calls. Jasper had mentioned Meemaw was tired, but had brushed off her questions. Their mother had seemed stressed, but had said everything was fine when Magnolia pressed. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "We tried," he said, and she could hear the manipulation sliding into his voice like honey over broken glass. "But you were always too busy with your— what did you call it? Your transformative fellowship?" He made air quotes with his fingers. "Real convenient timing for your spiritual journey, running off right when your family needed you most." "I applied for that fellowship 2 years ago. You know that. And you could have deferred it, could have chosen family over your own selfish dreams." He moved closer to her, and she caught the smell of stale beer and unwashed clothes. "But you didn't. You left, and somebody had to pick up the pieces. So you moved into my apartment, without asking?" "I moved into a place where I could be close to family while taking care of Meemaw. Where I could build something useful instead of chasing fantasies halfway around the world." His voice was rising now, taking on the righteous indignation he'd perfected in childhood. "I'm starting a business, Maggie. Historic tours for the tourists. Somebody has to represent our family's legacy properly." She wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Jasper, who'd dropped out of UGA and hadn't held a steady job in his life, suddenly the family's responsible representative. But the laughter died in her throat as she looked around her violated space. Her books were gone from the shelves. Her art supplies had vanished. Even her carefully chosen throw pillows had been replaced with sports-themed cushions. "You can't just take over someone's home, Jasper." "Take over?" His eyes flashed with practiced hurt. "I'm protecting it. Do you have any idea what could have happened to this place while you were gone? Break-ins, squatters, damage from that storm we had in May. I've been taking care of everything. This is insane." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Mama." "Go ahead," he said, settling back onto the sofa with supreme confidence. "Call her. See whose side she takes." Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright with forced cheer. "Magnolia, honey, you're back. How was your flight?" "Mama, Jasper is in my apartment. He's living here." A pause. Then, more carefully. "Well, of course he is, darling. We discussed this." "We most certainly did not." Magnolia Beauregard. And there it was. The steel beneath the magnolia, her mother's voice taking on the tone that had ended arguments for 3 generations. "Your brother has been holding down the fort while you've been gallivanting around the world. The least you can do is show some gratitude." "Gratitude? For him stealing my apartment?" "Don't be dramatic. Jasper has been taking care of family business while you were pursuing your interests. The boy has finally found his calling with this tour company, and he needs a professional address. Your apartment serves that purpose beautifully." Magnolia felt the old familiar weight settling on her chest, the suffocating pressure of family expectations disguised as love. "This is my home, Mama. And we're your family, sugar. I suggest you remember which one matters more." The line went dead. Jasper was watching her with that satisfied smirk she remembered from childhood, the expression he wore when he'd successfully gotten her in trouble while positioning himself as the innocent party. "Funny thing about family," he said, picking up his controller again. "They tend to side with the person who actually shows up when it matters." Magnolia stared at him, at her transformed apartment, at the complete upheaval of the life she'd carefully built. The hand-woven textiles in her bag suddenly felt absurdly foreign. like artifacts from someone else's dreams. The confident woman, who'd spent 6 months learning to heal others, felt herself shrinking back into the compliant daughter who'd never learned to fight for herself. But underneath the familiar pattern of defeat, something else was stirring. A quiet fury that had been born in the clear air of New Zealand mountains and strengthened by months of learning that sometimes the greatest respect for tradition came from refusing to be crushed by it. This wasn't just about an apartment anymore. This was about who she was allowed to be and who got to decide. The Spanish moss outside her windows swayed in the humid breeze, and for the first time since coming home, Magnolia wondered if the roots that had always anchored her might actually be chains instead. The Spanish moss outside her windows swayed in the humid breeze, and Magnolia stood there for a moment longer, watching Jasper's fingers dance across his controller as if the conversation had never happened. The casual dismissal stung worse than his occupation of her space. She'd been reduced to an inconvenience in her own home. "I'm going to see Meemaw," she said finally. "Good idea," Jasper replied without looking up. "Maybe you can explain to her why you weren't here when she needed you most." The drive to Ardsley Park felt like traveling backward through time. Each familiar street corner, each grand southern mansion draped in its ancient oaks seemed to whisper the same message. You tried to leave, but you always come back. This is who you are. This is where you belong. The Beauregard family home stood like a monument to Old South gentility. 2 stories of pristine white columns and wraparound porches that had weathered everything from Sherman's March to Hurricane David. Magnolia had grown up hearing how her great-great-grandmother had hidden the family silver in the well when the Yankees came through. How 4 generations of Beauregard women had sacrificed their dreams to preserve the family name and property. She parked in the circular drive and noticed Beau's Mercedes was there too. Of course, Mama would have assembled the troops. The front door opened before she could knock, and there was Delia Beauregard Whitman in all her steel magnolia glory. At 54, she maintained the kind of carefully preserved beauty that came from good genes, expensive skincare, and the absolute certainty that appearances mattered more than almost anything else. Her honey blonde hair was swept into a perfect chignon, her linen dress pressed to perfection despite the humidity. "Magnolia, darling." The embrace was warm but brief, calculated to convey love without mussing anything. "You look thin. Didn't they feed you properly over there?" "I'm fine, Mama. Where's Meemaw?" "In the parlor, of course. We're all waiting." Delia's voice carried the kind of patient disapproval that suggested Magnolia was late to her own intervention. The parlor hadn't changed since Magnolia's childhood. All heavy drapes and ancestral portraits, with Confederate memorabilia displayed like religious relics. Meemaw sat in her wheelchair by the window, looking smaller than Magnolia remembered, but with her eyes still sharp as cut glass. Beau stood near the mantelpiece, his tall frame uncomfortable in the formal setting, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed but his expression troubled. "There she is," Delia announced, as if presenting evidence to a jury. "Our world traveler." Magnolia went straight to her grandmother, kneeling beside the wheelchair. Meemaw's left hand was curled slightly, and her speech seemed slower, but her eyes tracked Magnolia's movements with perfect clarity. "Meemaw, I'm so sorry. I wish I'd known." "She's fine now," Delia interrupted, settling into her throne-like chair with practiced grace. "Thanks to Jasper's devoted care. Perhaps you'd like to hear what's been happening while you were finding yourself in New Zealand." Beau cleared his throat. "Magnolia, why don't you sit down? We have quite a bit to discuss." She remained kneeling by Meemaw's chair, one hand resting gently on her grandmother's arm. The old woman's eyes seemed to be trying to communicate something. But when she opened her mouth, only garbled sounds emerged. Frustration flickered across her weathered features. "The stroke affected her speech," Delia explained with the kind of patient sadness she'd perfected for social occasions. "The doctors say it may improve with time, but for now, she has difficulty expressing herself clearly." "Was it severe?" Magnolia asked, studying her grandmother's face for signs of the sharp wit she'd always admired. "Severe enough," Beau said quietly. "She was unconscious for 2 days. We weren't sure she'd wake up." Guilt crashed over Magnolia like a wave. While she'd been learning to weave traditional patterns and studying the healing properties of indigenous art, her grandmother had been fighting for her life. Which brings us to the matter at hand, Delia continued, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency she used in real estate negotiations. Jasper stepped up during the crisis. He moved back home to help with Meemaw's care, organized her medical appointments, made sure she had everything she needed. It was illuminating to see which of my children truly understands family responsibility. The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep while maintaining perfect Southern politeness. Magnolia felt the familiar weight of family expectations settling around her shoulders like a lead blanket. That doesn't give him the right to take over my apartment. Your apartment, Delia repeated, as if testing the words. How interesting that you still think of it that way. Beau shifted uncomfortably. Delia, perhaps we should... No, Beauregard. She needs to hear this. Delia's voice carried the authority of 4 generations of Southern matriarchs. Magnolia, your great-great-grandmother didn't have the luxury of running off to pursue her dreams when the family needed her. She stayed. She sacrificed. She understood that individual desires matter less than family legacy. This isn't 1864, Mama. Isn't it? Delia's eyes flashed. The principles remain the same. Duty, sacrifice, understanding that we are part of something larger than ourselves. She gestured around the room, taking in the portraits and memorabilia. Every woman in those paintings understood what you seem to have forgotten. That family comes first. Magnolia felt the old programming kicking in, the lifetime of conditioning that made her want to apologize, to smooth things over, to be the good daughter who never caused trouble. But underneath it, something else was stirring. A voice that sounded like the Maori healing women who'd taught her that sometimes the most profound act of respect for your ancestors was refusing to repeat their limitations. And what about Jasper's responsibilities, his education, his debts? Beau's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Delia's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Jasper is finding his way, Delia said smoothly. Young men sometimes need more time to mature, but when the crisis came, he was here. You were not. Because nobody told me there was a crisis. We tried to reach you, Delia continued, her voice taking on the tone of patient explanation. But you were always so busy with your fellowship activities. It became clear that your attention was elsewhere. That's not true. Magnolia's voice was rising despite her efforts to stay calm. I called every week. I asked about everyone. Nobody mentioned. You asked the right questions to salve your conscience, Delia interrupted. But you didn't really listen to the answers. If you had, you would have heard the strain in our voices. You would have understood that we needed you. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment Magnolia almost believed it. Had she been inattentive? Had she missed subtle signs of distress in their calls? The doubt crept in like poison, and she hated herself for feeling it. Meemaw made a sound, something between frustration and anger. Her good hand gestured toward Magnolia, then toward the window, then back again. She was trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come. It's all right, Mama, Delia said soothingly to Meemaw. Don't upset yourself. But Magnolia caught something in her grandmother's eyes, a look of fierce intelligence trapped behind damaged neural pathways. Meemaw wasn't confused. She was frustrated, and she was trying to tell Magnolia something important. Jasper has made himself indispensable, Beau said quietly, his lawyer's mind clearly at work even as he struggled with the family dynamics. He's been very dedicated to Meemaw's care. How dedicated? Magnolia asked, noting the careful way Beau chose his words. He organized all her medications, drove her to appointments, handled the insurance paperwork, Delia listed proudly. He even researched the best rehabilitation facilities and coordinated with her physical therapist. Magnolia looked at her grandmother again. Meemaw's eyes were sharp, alert, following the conversation with perfect understanding. For someone who'd had a severe stroke 6 weeks ago, she seemed remarkably aware, and remarkably frustrated by the conversation happening around her. Show Magnolia the receipts. Jasper brought them for you to see, Delia said. producing a manila folder with the kind of theatrical flourish she'd perfected in community theater. Groceries, medical supplies, gas for all those trips to the doctor. He's been meticulous about documenting his contributions to family care. Magnolia flipped through the receipts with growing unease. They were too neat, too organized, too perfectly documented for someone who'd never managed to keep track of his own finances. And many of them were recent. Very recent. As in, dated after she'd booked her return flight. "These are all from the last 2 weeks," she said slowly. "He's been especially attentive lately," Delia replied smoothly. "I think he knew you'd want to see evidence of his dedication." The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Jasper had clearly prepared for her return, creating a paper trail of responsibility that covered barely 10% of the time she'd been gone. But Delia presented it as if it represented 6 months of devoted care. "Where is Jasper now?" Magnolia asked. "Working," Delia said with pride. "He's meeting with potential investors for his tour company. Finally found his calling, our boy has. He's developing historically accurate tours that honor our city's real heritage, not the sanitized version they sell to tourists." Bo made a small sound, quickly covered by a cough. When Magnolia glanced at him, his eyes were fixed on the Persian rug beneath his feet. "He needs a professional address for his business correspondence," Delia continued. "Your apartment serves that purpose beautifully. And frankly, after 6 months away, you could use some time to readjust to home. Perhaps you could stay here while you transition back to Savannah life." "I don't need to readjust. I need my apartment back." "What you need," Delia's voice carried the final authority of a closing argument, "is to remember that individual desires don't supersede family obligations. Jasper has found his purpose in serving this family. The question is whether you're prepared to find yours." The weight of generations pressed down on Magnolia, all those portraits watching from the walls, all those stories of sacrifice and duty she'd grown up hearing. Be the good daughter. Don't make waves. Family comes first. Always family first. But she thought of the Maori women who taught her about Wakapapa, the genealogical connections that honor ancestors, not by repeating their limitations, but by growing beyond them. She thought of the confidence she'd built over 6 months, of proving she could stand on her own, make her own decisions, trust her own judgment. "I'll think about it," she said finally, hating herself for the compromise but needing time to process what was happening. "That's all we ask," Delia said, with satisfaction. "Family consideration." As Magnolia kissed Meemaw goodbye, the old woman gripped her hand with surprising strength. Her mouth moved silently, forming words her damaged speech couldn't produce. But her eyes were clear, urgent, trying to warn Magnolia about something she couldn't articulate. Driving away from the family home, Magnolia felt like she was drowning in familiar patterns. The confident woman who'd spent 6 months learning to heal others was disappearing, replaced by the dutiful daughter who'd never learned to trust her own perceptions over family authority. But underneath the doubt and guilt, a small flame of anger was beginning to burn. Something wasn't right about Jasper's story. Something wasn't right about the timing, the receipts, the way Bo avoided her eyes when Delia talked about Jasper's business ventures. The Spanish moss hung heavy in the humid air, and Magnolia realized she needed to talk to someone who wouldn't gaslight her into questioning her own reality. Someone who would tell her the truth, even if it wasn't what the family wanted to hear. She needed Ruby May. The Spanish moss hung heavy in the humid air as Magnolia sat in her car outside the family home, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. The weight of the family's expectations pressed down on her chest like the oppressive Georgia heat, making it hard to breathe. She needed someone who would tell her the truth. Someone who wouldn't wrap manipulation in honeyed words and call it love. Ruby Mae Johnson's shotgun house in the Starland District was a world away from the antebellum grandeur of Ardsley Park. Painted a bold turquoise with white trim, it sat among other renovated homes where young professionals and artists had transformed a working-class neighborhood into something vibrant and alive. Wind chimes made from recycled kitchen utensils hung from the front porch, and herb gardens sprawled in organized chaos around the foundation. Magnolia found Ruby Mae in her kitchen, which had been converted into a test facility for her catering business. The air was thick with the scent of blackened shrimp and praline bread pudding, and every surface was covered with cooling racks and labeled containers. "Well, Look what the cat dragged back from across the world, Ruby May said without looking up from her notebook where she was recording recipe modifications. At 31, she'd built her business from nothing, transforming traditional low-country cuisine into something that honored its roots while refusing to be limited by them. Her natural hair was twisted into an elaborate wrap, and her apron bore the logo of Ruby's Revival, a phoenix rising from a bed of collard greens. Ruby May, I need to talk to someone who won't lie to me. That got her friend's attention. Ruby May set down her pen and really looked at Magnolia for the first time, taking in the tension around her eyes, the way she held her shoulders like she was bracing for impact. Jasper? She asked simply. How did you— Child, please. That boy's been spinning tales all over town while you were gone. Come sit. I'll make us some tea, and you can tell Ruby May what's got you looking like you've seen a ghost. They settled on the back porch with sweet tea and leftover test samples of Ruby May's latest creation, bourbon pecan tassies that managed to be both sophisticated and comfort food at the same time. The late afternoon sun filtered through the crepe myrtles, and for the first time since landing in Savannah, Magnolia felt like she could breathe. Start from the beginning, Ruby May said, settling into her rocking chair with the kind of direct attention that had made her successful in business and invaluable as a friend. Magnolia told her everything. Finding Jasper in the apartment, the family meeting, Mima's stroke, the receipts, Delia's lecture about family duty. Ruby May listened without interrupting, but her expression grew progressively darker. 6 weeks ago? Ruby May asked when Magnolia finished. Jasper said Mima had her stroke 6 weeks ago? That's what he claimed. Why? Ruby May was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her tea glass. Magnolia, I saw your grandmother at the Piggly Wiggly 3 weeks ago. She was walking with a cane, moving a little slow, but she was definitely walking and talking. Complained for 10 minutes about how they'd rearranged the cereal aisle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words hit Magnolia like cold water. Walking. But she's in a wheelchair. Her speech is, Honey, I don't know what game your family is playing, but your grandmother's stroke wasn't nearly as severe as they're making it out to be. Ruby May leaned forward, her voice taking on the edge it got when she was dealing with vendors who tried to cheat her. She told me herself she'd had what she called a little episode, about 2 months back. Spent one night in the hospital for observation, and was doing fine. 2 months back. That would be while I was still in New Zealand, but before Jasper started his sob story about how you abandoned the family in their time of need. Ruby May's voice was flat with disgust. That boy has been working this angle for weeks, talking up his sacrifice to anyone who'll listen. Magnolia felt something cold and hard settling in her stomach. What else has he been saying? Oh, honey, you sure you want to hear this? I need to hear it. Ruby May sighed and set down her tea. He's been telling people that you've been flighty since college, always looking for an excuse to run away from responsibility. Says the family has been supporting your artistic phases for years, and this New Zealand thing was just the latest example of you choosing yourself over family. Each word felt like a slap. The narrative was so carefully constructed, painting her fellowship, something she'd worked years to achieve, as selfish escapism. He's also been dropping hints about money troubles, Ruby May continued. Nothing direct, mind you, but enough to make people think your family might be struggling financially and could use some support. What kind of support? The kind that involves him moving into your apartment without paying rent while he gets his business off the ground. Ruby May's air quotes were sharp with sarcasm. Speaking of which, you know anything about this tour company he's supposedly starting? Mama mentioned it. Historic tours, she said. Ruby May snorted. Historic tours, my ass. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, and for the first time since coming home, Magnolia saw it not as a shroud, but as a canopy, sheltering new growth underneath its ancient branches. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze as Magnolia sat on Ruby May's porch, surrounded by the warmth of chosen family and the growing certainty that she needed to fight for more than just her apartment. She needed to fight for her right to exist as an adult without family manipulation masquerading as love. First thing tomorrow, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. I'm seeing a lawyer. Ruby May pulled out her phone with the efficiency of someone who solved problems for a living. Tobias Mitchell, best tenant rights attorney in Savannah, and he specializes in family property disputes. Used to be a big-shot corporate lawyer in Atlanta before he burned out and moved here for the slower pace. She scrolled through her contacts. He handled the legal work when I bought this place. Straight shooter, doesn't tolerate manipulation. From any direction. Can you get me in to see him? Honey, for you? I'll make sure he sees you first thing. Ruby May was already dialing. Toby, it's Ruby May. I need a favor. By 9 the next morning, Magnolia was sitting in Tobias Mitchell's office in a converted Victorian mansion on Abercorn Street. The building had been carefully restored to preserve its architectural integrity, while serving as professional offices, and the contrast between old and new seemed appropriate for her situation. Honoring the past without being trapped by it. Toby Mitchell was a compact man in his early 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of steady presence that came from years of dealing with people at their worst. His office was lined with law books and Savannah history, creating an atmosphere that felt both authoritative and comfortable. Ruby May says you're dealing with family members who think emotional manipulation trumps legal rights, he said without preamble, pouring coffee from a carafe that smelled like it had been brewing since dawn. Tell me what's happening. Magnolia laid out the situation with the clinical detachment she'd learned in her therapy training. The apartment takeover, the family meeting, the inconsistencies in Jasper's story. Toby listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Let me start with the good news, he said when she finished. Georgia tenant law is very clear about unauthorized occupancy. If your brother is living in your apartment without being on the lease and without your permission, he's trespassing. The fact that he's related to you doesn't change that legal reality. Relief flooded through Magnolia like cool water. So I can have him evicted? In theory, yes. In practice, it's more complicated because he's family, and because he appears to have created some documentation suggesting he has permission to be there. You mentioned receipts for household supplies? Receipts dating back only 2 weeks, though he's been there at least 6. Toby made a note. That suggests preparation rather than genuine caretaking. What about mail? Is he receiving correspondence at your address? I don't know. I only got back yesterday. We'll need to check that. If he's been establishing residency at your address, having mail delivered, using it for business purposes, registering to vote, it complicates the eviction process. Toby leaned forward. But here's what really concerns me. You mentioned he's supposedly starting a business and looking for investors? According to my mother, yes. Some kind of historic tours company. Using your address as his business location? The implication hit her like a slap. I assume so. Mama said he needed a professional address. Toby's expression darkened. Ms. Beauregard, if your brother is soliciting investment in a business using your address without your knowledge or consent, and if that business doesn't actually exist, or is misrepresented, we're talking about potential fraud charges. That's not just a family dispute. That's criminal activity. The coffee in Magnolia's cup had gone cold, but she barely noticed. What should I do? First, we document everything. I'll draft a formal notice requiring him to vacate the premises within 30 days. That starts the legal clock ticking and establishes your position on record. Second, we need to understand what exactly he's been doing with your address and whether any legal documents have been filed using it. Can you help me with that? Absolutely. I have contacts at the courthouse and the business registration office. We can run a search this afternoon to see if any corporate entities have been established using your address. Toby glanced at his calendar. How's 2 o'clock? Perfect. Magnolia felt like she was finally taking concrete action instead of drowning in family manipulation. There's one more thing, Toby said carefully. Family property disputes can get ugly very quickly, especially when there are financial pressures involved. Are you prepared for your family to escalate their tactics when they realize you're serious about legal action? Before Magnolia could answer, her phone rang. Beau's name appeared on the screen, and something in the timing felt ominous. I should take this, she said apologetically. Magnolia? Beau's voice was strained, barely recognizable. Can you meet me somewhere private? I need to talk to you, and I can't do it at home. Is everything all right? No, it's not. Can you meet me at Forsyth Park? The cafe by the fountain? Toby was watching her face carefully. When she hung up, he said, Family emergency? My stepfather wants to meet. He sounded scared. Take the meeting, but be careful what you agree to without talking to me first. Sometimes family members who seem sympathetic are actually gathering information for the other side. An hour later, Magnolia sat across from Beau at a small table outside the Forsyth Park Cafe, watching her stepfather's hands shake as he tried to light a cigarette, a habit she'd never seen him indulge. I quit these things 10 years ago, he said, finally getting the lighter to work. But last night I bought a pack. Beauregard Whitman III had always been the calm center of family storms, the gentleman lawyer who could negotiate peace between warring factions. Seeing him this agitated was deeply unsettling. Beau, what's happening? He took a deep drag and exhaled slowly, staring at the moss-draped oaks around the fountain. Your mother doesn't know I'm here. If she found out... Found out what? That I'm about to betray everything she's worked for to save this family. He turned to look at her directly, and she saw fear in his eyes, real, bone-deep terror. Magnolia, we're in trouble. Serious financial trouble. The kind that could cost us the house, the properties, everything. The words hit her like ice, water. What kind of trouble? Your mother has been using family properties as collateral for loans. First, it was just a small line of credit to help with your grandmother's medical expenses after her actual stroke, which was minor, by the way, exactly like Ruby May told you. But then Jasper's gambling debts started coming due, and Delia convinced herself that one more loan would solve everything. How much are we talking about? Beau's laugh was bitter. $200,000, secured by liens on the family home and 3 rental properties I own. Magnolia felt sick. Why would you agree to that? Because I love your mother, and because Jasper convinced us both that his business venture was legitimate. He had investors lined up, he said. Real money people who understood the tourism potential in authentic historic experiences. Beau stubbed out his cigarette with violent motions. It was all lies, every word of it. The investors don't exist. The business plan, copied from a legitimate company in Charleston. The meetings he's been having, poker games where he's been losing more money than he's ever seen in his life. Magnolia thought about Jasper lounging on her sofa, playing video games without a care in the world, while their family's financial foundation crumbled around him. How long have you known? I started getting suspicious 3 weeks ago when the supposed investors wouldn't meet with me directly. Jasper always had excuses. They were traveling. They preferred to work through him. They were still reviewing final details. But I'm a lawyer, Magnolia. I know what legitimate business dealings look like. What did you find? The company he claimed was backing him? When I called their offices in Charleston, they'd never heard of Jasper Beauregard. The business registration he showed us, filed using your apartment address, but the paperwork was riddled with inconsistencies that would never pass a real legal review. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Does Mama know? Your mother knows something's wrong, but she's so invested in believing Jasper has finally found his way that she won't listen to evidence that contradicts that narrative. Yesterday I tried to show her the inconsistencies in his paperwork, and she accused me of being jealous of her son's success. Beau lit another cigarette with shaking hands. The loans come due in 6 weeks. If we can't pay, we lose everything. And Jasper. His voice broke slightly. Jasper disappeared. Last night. Didn't come home. Isn't answering his phone. I think the gambling creditors finally caught up with him. Or he realized you were getting close to the truth. Either way, we're left holding the bag for his debts while he's God knows where, probably running another con on some other unsuspecting family. Magnolia sat in silence, processing the magnitude of the disaster. Her family wasn't just manipulating her. They were destroying themselves trying to enable Jasper's self-destruction. Why are you telling me this? Beau met her eyes with something like desperation. Because you're the only one in this family who's ever shown any sense about money or consequences. And because... He hesitated. Because I need your help. What kind of help? I've been thinking about bankruptcy. It would save the house. Maybe one of the rental properties. But I can't do it without Delia's cooperation. And she won't even consider it as long as she believes Jasper's going to come through with some miraculous salvation. You want me to convince her to face reality? I want you to help me. I want you to help me save what's left of this family, Bo finished, his voice raw with exhaustion. Starting with getting the truth out there about what Jasper's really been doing. Magnolia stared at her stepfather across the cafe table, watching him smoke with the desperation of a drowning man. The magnitude of Jasper's deception was staggering, but what struck her most was how completely her family had been willing to sacrifice reality to maintain their preferred narrative. There's something else, she said slowly. I think Mima knows more than she's been able to tell us. Bo's head snapped up. What do you mean? Yesterday at the family meeting, she kept trying to communicate something. Her eyes were completely alert, but every time she tried to speak, Mama would interrupt or redirect the conversation. Magnolia thought about her grandmother's frustrated attempts at speech, the way her good hand had gestured urgently. I think she's been trying to warn us. About Jasper? About everything. Bo, what if she's not as impaired as everyone thinks? What if she's been watching this whole disaster unfold and trying to tell us the truth? Hope flickered in Bo's eyes for the first time since they'd sat down. If Evangeline has been aware of what's happening, if she's retained more cognitive function than we realized, she might have information that could help us understand the full scope of this mess. Magnolia was already standing. I need to talk to her alone, without Mama hovering and redirecting every conversation. Delia's showing properties until 5 today. If you went now. Can you keep her away if she comes back early? Bo nodded grimly. I'll think of something. But Magnolia, be careful. If your grandmother really has been trying to tell us something and we've all been too busy managing our own drama to listen. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy between them. An hour later, Magnolia stood on the front porch of the family home, her heart hammering as she used her key to let herself in. The house felt different without Delia's commanding presence, older somehow, full of whispered secrets and suppressed truths. She found Mima in the sunroom, positioned by the windows, where afternoon light filtered through Spanish moss to create shifting patterns on the hardwood floor. Her grandmother was awake but still, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her sharp eyes fixed on something beyond the garden. Mima? Magnolia pulled a chair close to the wheelchair, settling herself at eye level with her grandmother. It's just us. Mama's out showing properties. Evangeline Beauregard turned toward her granddaughter, and Magnolia saw something she'd missed during yesterday's formal family gathering. Not confusion or medical impairment, but relief, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. I know you've been trying to tell us something, Magnolia said gently, reaching for her grandmother's good hand. And I know everyone's been too busy talking to really listen. But I'm listening. Now. Mima's mouth worked silently for a moment, frustration flickering across her features. Then she squeezed Magnolia's hand and pointed toward the antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. The desk? You want me to look at something in the desk? A nod, emphatic and urgent. Magnolia went to the desk and tried the drawers, but they were locked. She looked back at her grandmother questioningly. Mima pointed to her wheelchair, then made a motion like she was reaching underneath something. Understanding flooded through Magnolia. Her grandmother was indicating a hiding place. She knelt beside the wheelchair and felt underneath the seat cushion until her fingers found a small key taped to the frame. The hiding spot was so perfectly concealed that it could only have been prepared by someone with full cognitive function and careful planning. You've been planning this, Magnolia said with growing excitement. You've been waiting for the right moment to show someone. The key fit the desk's main drawer, which opened to reveal neat stacks of papers, bank statements, and legal documents that looked nothing like the casual disorganization the family had attributed to Mima's condition. The top document was a handwritten letter in Evangeline's still elegant script, dated 3 weeks earlier. To whoever finally listens, I am not as impaired as my family believes. The stroke affected my speech center but left my mind clear. I have been watching and documenting everything while they treat me like a confused old woman who can't understand what's happening around her. Jasper has been forging my signature on financial documents. I have copies. He has been stealing from household accounts while claiming to care for me. He has been bringing gambling associates to this house when Delia and Bo are away. Most importantly, he has been intercepting mail and hiding legal notices that could help the family understand their true financial situation. I pray someone will read this before it's too late to save what's left. Evangeline Beauregard. Magnolia's hands trembled as she read. Her grandmother hadn't just been aware of Jasper's deception. She'd been documenting it with the methodical precision of someone trained by necessity to survive family chaos. Mima, this is incredible. But why didn't you try harder to tell us? Evangeline's expression grew sad, and she pointed to her throat, then shook her head. She mimed trying to speak, becoming frustrated, and then pointed to Delia's empty chair, with an expression that conveyed years of being dismissed and patronized. The picture became clear. Every time Mima had tried to communicate her concerns, her speech difficulties had made it easy for the family to dismiss her attempts as confusion or medical impairment. And Delia, so invested in her narrative about Jasper's reformation, had used her mother's condition as an excuse to avoid hearing inconvenient truths. Magnolia continued reading through the documents. Bank statements showing unexplained withdrawals, photocopies of checks with forged signatures. Most damning of all, a business registration document for Beauregard Historic Experiences that listed Evangeline as the primary investor and financial backer, with a signature that was obviously forged. He's been using your name to legitimize his fake business? Mima nodded grimly and pointed to another stack of papers. These were letters from creditors, legal notices, and final warnings, all addressed to the family home but clearly intercepted before they could reach Delia, or Bo. Jasper had been controlling the flow of information, making sure his parents only saw what he wanted them to see. This is evidence of mail theft, forgery, and fraud, Magnolia said, her therapy training helping her stay calm even as rage built in her chest. Mima, this could save the family. This proves that Jasper's been systematically deceiving everyone. But when she looked up, her grandmother was crying. Not the confused tears of someone overwhelmed by circumstances, but the clear-eyed grief of someone who understood exactly what her evidence meant. You love him too, Magnolia said softly. Even knowing what he's done, he's still your grandson. Mima nodded, and then pointed to herself, then to Magnolia, then made a gesture that encompassed the whole house. The meaning was clear. We have to save the family, even from itself. The question is how to use this information without destroying him completely. Magnolia thought about Bo's desperation, about her mother's desperate investment in denial, about Jasper somewhere out there, running from consequences that were finally catching up with him, and how to get Mama to face the truth without breaking her heart. Mima reached for the pen and paper on the desk, her movements slow but determined. In careful script, she wrote, "Sometimes love means letting people face consequences. I learned this too late with my own children." The words hit Magnolia like a revelation. Her grandmother, who had survived the integration crisis, Hurricane David, and 3 husbands, understood something about family dynamics that the rest of them had never grasped. That enabling destructive behavior wasn't love, it was fear disguised as devotion. How long have you been protecting this family from the truth about Jasper? Mima wrote, Since he was 12, and I caught him stealing from my purse. Your mother said it was a phase. 23 years later, it's still a phase. The scope of the family's denial was breathtaking. For over a decade, they had been covering for Jasper's behavior, making excuses, providing safety nets, and refusing to let him experience real consequences. And Evangeline had been watching it all, understanding that their misguided love was actually destroying the person they were trying to save. What changed your mind? Why document everything now? Because he's not a child anymore, she wrote. And because watching your family destroy themselves to save someone who doesn't want to be saved is a form of suicide. Magnolia thought about her own role in the family drama, how her absence had been weaponized, how her apartment had been stolen, how her independent life had been painted as selfish abandonment. But underneath the manipulation, there was a deeper truth. The family had been so invested in managing Jasper's destruction that they had lost sight of their own lives and dreams. I'm going to use this evidence, she said finally. Not to destroy Jasper, but to save the rest of us. To force everyone to face reality instead of living in the fantasy that's bankrupting us all. Meemaw gripped her hand with surprising strength and nodded. Then she wrote one final note. Your New Zealand experience taught you something we never could. That love sometimes means saying no. Use that wisdom. As Magnolia carefully organized the documents and prepared to leave, she realized that her grandmother had given her more than evidence of Jasper's crimes. She had given her permission to break the family's cycle of enabling and denial, to choose truth over comfortable lies, to love her family enough to let them face consequences. The afternoon sun was slanting lower through the Spanish moss when she heard Delia's car in the driveway. Moving quickly, she locked the desk drawer and replaced the key in its hiding place, but not before slipping the most crucial documents into her purse. Magnolia, what are you doing here? Delia's voice carried sharp suspicion as she entered the sunroom. Visiting with Meemaw, Magnolia said calmly, kissing her grandmother's forehead. She seems to be feeling better today. Delia's eyes narrowed as she studied the scene, clearly sensing something she couldn't quite identify. Well, I hope you haven't been tiring her with too many questions. The doctor says she needs rest and calm. Of course, Mama. Magnolia smiled with the polite compliance that had gotten her through childhood, but underneath the familiar performance, she felt the steel her grandmother had just helped her discover. I'll see you both soon. As she drove away from the family home, the hidden documents felt like weapons in her purse, not instruments of destruction, but tools of liberation. Her grandmother had been fighting this battle alone for years, documenting the truth while everyone around her chose comfortable denial. Now it was time to use that truth to set them all free, whether they wanted freedom or not. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, and for the first time since coming home, Magnolia saw it not as a shroud, but as witness, ancient and enduring, watching generations make the same mistakes while hoping someone would finally choose to break the cycle. Tomorrow, she would take Meemaw's evidence to Toby and begin the process of legal action. Tonight, she would prepare for the family explosion that would follow. Because as her grandmother had finally taught her, sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destruction, even when that someone is family. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze as Magnolia sat in her car outside Judge Carlisle Pemberton's Ardsley Park home, her grandmother's evidence carefully organized in a manila folder on the passenger seat. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her chest like the humid Georgia air. But underneath the anxiety was something she hadn't felt since returning to Savannah. The clarity of being on the right side of truth. Toby had suggested involving Judge Pemberton when she'd shown him Meemaw's documents that afternoon. This isn't just about tenant law anymore, he'd said grimly. Your brother has committed multiple felonies. But more importantly, your family needs to hear the truth from someone they can't dismiss or manipulate. Carlisle Pemberton has known the Beauregards for decades. If anyone can cut through the family dynamics and force them to face reality, it's him. The judge's home was a stately colonial revival that spoke of old Savannah money and established authority. Spanish moss draped the live oaks in his front yard like nature's own courtroom curtains, and the house itself seemed to radiate the kind of moral weight that came from generations of respected service to the community. Magnolia had called an emergency family meeting under the guise of wanting to discuss a compromise about the apartment situation. What she hadn't told them was that Toby and Judge Pemberton would be there as witnesses to ensure that legal reality couldn't be dismissed as family drama. Delia's Mercedes was already in the circular drive, along with Beau's sedan. As Magnolia walked to the front door, she could hear raised voices from inside, her mother's crystalline southern accent cutting through Beau's calmer tones like a blade through silk. Judge Pemberton answered the door himself, his 70-year-old frame still imposing in a navy suit that spoke of lifetime habits of dressing for serious occasions. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his blue eyes sharp with intelligence, and his presence immediately commanded the kind of respect that came from 40 years on the bench. "Magnolia, my dear," he said warmly, though she caught the gravity beneath his courteous smile. "Your family is in the living room. Mr. Mitchell is already here with the documents you provided." The living room was a study in understated authority. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes and Savannah history, family portraits spanning generations of judicial service, and furniture that suggested comfort without ostentation. Delia sat rigidly on the edge of an antique settee, her posture screaming barely controlled fury. Beau stood by the fireplace, his face pale with the exhaustion of a man who'd been carrying secrets too heavy for his shoulders. Toby sat at a small table near the windows, legal documents spread before him like evidence at trial. He looked up as Magnolia entered, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes conveying quiet support. "Now that we're all here," Judge Pemberton said, settling into his leather chair with the kind of presence that had controlled countless courtrooms, "perhaps someone can explain why we're discussing family property matters in my living room instead of resolving them through normal channels." "Because certain people have decided that family loyalty means nothing," Delia said icily, her gaze fixed on Magnolia with laser intensity. "Because some children think legal technicalities matter more than blood and duty." "Mama," Magnolia began. "No." Delia's voice carried the authority of generations of Southern matriarchs. "You've said enough. Dragging family business to lawyers and judges like we're common criminals instead of trying to work things out among ourselves like civilized people." Judge Pemberton raised one silver eyebrow. "Mrs. Beauregard Whitman, perhaps we should hear the facts before we discuss the propriety of seeking legal counsel." Beau cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Carlyle, the situation is complicated." "Most family disputes are," the judge replied calmly. "That's why we have laws governing property rights and tenant protections. They exist to provide clarity when emotions cloud judgment." Toby opened the first folder on his table. "Your Honor, if I may present the facts as we understand them. Ms. Magnolia Beauregard holds a legal lease on an apartment at 412 Bull Street. While she was out of the country on a 6-month fellowship, her brother Jasper moved into the property without permission and has been living there for approximately 8 weeks. Family property, family decisions," Delia interrupted. "Jasper was protecting Magnolia's interests while caring for his sick grandmother. Actually," Toby continued smoothly, "the evidence suggests a different narrative. Mr. Jasper Beauregard has been using the apartment not for family caregiving, but as collateral for gambling debts and as a business address for fraudulent investment solicitations." The word fraudulent hit the room like a gunshot. Delia's perfect composure cracked slightly, and Beau's face went ashen. "That's a serious accusation," Judge Pemberton said quietly. "I assume you have documentation?" Toby slid a stack of papers across the table. Bank records showing unauthorized use of family accounts, business registration documents with forged signatures, and most significantly, correspondence that was intercepted to prevent the family from understanding their true financial situation. Judge Pemberton examined the documents with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate evidence. His expression grew progressively graver as he read, and when he finally looked up, his face carried the weight of judicial authority. "Mrs. Beauregard Whitman, were you aware that your son has been forging your mother's signature on financial documents?" "That's impossible," Delia said. But her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Jasper has been caring for Mama, handling her paperwork with her permission." "Your mother's handwriting analysis suggests otherwise," Toby interjected, producing another document. "Mrs. Evangeline Beauregard has been documenting discrepancies for weeks. Her cognitive function is largely intact, despite the speech difficulties caused by her minor stroke." The revelation hit Delia like a physical blow. "Mama can't. She doesn't." The doctors said her speech was affected," Judge Pemberton corrected gently. "Not her cognitive abilities or her legal capacity, and according to these documents, she's been trying to warn your family about financial irregularities for some time." Beau moved closer to examine the papers, his lawyer's training taking over despite his emotional investment. "Carlyle, if these signatures are forged, if Jasper has been intercepting legal notices, then we're looking at mail theft, forgery, and potentially wire fraud if he's been soliciting investments based on false pretenses." The judge's voice carried the gravity of someone who understood exactly what legal consequences such actions carried. "These aren't family disputes, Beauregard. These are federal crimes." The weight of reality was finally penetrating Delia's carefully constructed denial. She sat in stunned silence, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the scope of her son's deception. "Where is Jasper now?" Judge Pemberton asked. "We don't know," Bo admitted. "He didn't come home last night. Hasn't answered his phone." "That's not uncommon when gambling addicts realize their creditors are closing in," Toby said matter-of-factly. "The question is what happens next. Ms. Beauregard needs her apartment back. The family needs to understand their true financial situation, and someone needs to decide whether to pursue criminal charges against Jasper." "Criminal charges?" Delia's voice was barely a whisper. "Against my son? Against a man who has committed multiple felonies while using his family's love as a shield," Judge Pemberton corrected firmly. "Mrs. Beauregard Whitman, I've known your family for decades. I officiated your wedding to Beauregard. I watched both your children grow up. But what I'm seeing in these documents isn't family drama. It's systematic criminal behavior that could have destroyed multiple lives." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock and the sound of Delia's quiet sobbing. The steel Magnolia facade had finally cracked, revealing the frightened mother underneath who had spent years enabling her son's destruction in the name of love. What do we do now?" she asked brokenly. Judge Pemberton leaned forward, with the kind of paternal authority that had guided countless families through their darkest moments. "First, you face the truth about your son's behavior instead of making excuses for it. Second, you support your daughter's right to reclaim her property and her independence. Third, you consider whether continuing to shield Jasper from consequences is actually helping him or merely enabling his further self-destruction." "He's my baby," Delia whispered. "I can't just abandon him." "No one's asking you to abandon him," Magnolia said gently, speaking for the first time since the evidence had been presented. "But maybe it's time to love him enough to let him face the consequences of his choices. Maybe that's the only way he'll ever get the help he really needs." Bo moved to sit beside his wife, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness. "Delia, we've been enabling him for years. Look where it's gotten us. Look where it's gotten him." "The apartment reverts to Magnolia immediately," Judge Pemberton declared with quiet finality. "That's not negotiable. It's her legal right. As for the financial situation and potential criminal charges, those are decisions this family will need to make together. But they need to be made based on truth, not on the fantasy that's been destroying you all." Toby gathered his documents with professional efficiency. "I'll prepare the formal eviction notice and trespass warning. If Jasper returns to the apartment, he'll be subject to immediate arrest. And if he contacts any of you," Judge Pemberton added, "I strongly recommend that you insist he turn himself in to authorities and seek legal counsel. Running from this situation will only make his eventual legal consequences more severe." As the meeting broke up, Delia sat in stunned silence while Bo handled the practical arrangements with quiet dignity. Magnolia felt no triumph in her mother's pain, only sadness for the years of denial that had led to this moment. "Magnolia," Judge Pemberton said as she prepared to leave, "I want you to know that standing up for yourself in this situation required considerable courage. Your family's love for Jasper became toxic when it prevented them from seeing his need for real help. You may have saved more than just your apartment tonight." As she drove away from the judge's house, Magnolia felt the weight of the last few days settling into something like resolution. The confident woman who had spent 6 months learning to heal others had finally learned to protect herself. The apartment was legally hers again. Her family was finally facing the truth about Jasper's behavior. But underneath the relief was a deeper sadness. For the brother who had chosen destruction over growth, for the mother who had loved so fiercely that she'd enabled what she most feared, and for the family dynamics that had taken a crisis to finally change. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, ancient and enduring, witness to generations of family drama and survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they all learned to live with truth instead of comfortable lies. But tonight, for the first time since coming home, Magnolia felt like she could breathe freely in her own life. The cycle was finally broken. Now came the harder work of healing what remained. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze as Magnolia finally turned her key in her own front door for the second time since returning to Savannah. But this time, The legal papers in her purse gave her the authority to reclaim what had always been hers. This time, she wasn't walking into a violation. She was coming home. The apartment was empty, but violated. Jasper had vanished sometime in the night, taking his gaming equipment and clothes, but leaving behind the detritus of 8 weeks of consequence-free living. Empty pizza boxes stacked on her kitchen counter. Beer bottles lined up like soldiers on every surface. The hardwood floors she'd refinished herself were scarred with scratches from furniture moved carelessly. Her vintage velvet sofa bore stains that spoke of parties she'd never consented to host. But worse than the physical damage was the spiritual violation, the sense that her carefully curated sanctuary had been transformed into something foreign and hostile. Every corner held evidence of a life lived without consideration for anyone else's dreams or boundaries. Finn appeared in the doorway behind her, having driven straight from Judge Pemberton's house to offer practical support. Jesus, he breathed, taking in the destruction. It's like a teenager threw a 2-month party while his parents were away. Except this teenager is 23 and has been systematically destroying his family for over a decade, Magnolia said, her voice surprisingly steady. The art therapy training had taught her to process trauma by naming it clearly, without emotional avoidance. Ruby May arrived 20 minutes later with cleaning supplies, takeout containers from her catering business, and the kind of no-nonsense energy that transformed overwhelming situations into manageable tasks. First things first, she announced, setting down industrial-strength cleaning products and rubber gloves. We're going to erase every trace of that boy's presence from this space. Then we're going to eat real food and talk about how you want to move forward. They worked in companionable silence for the first hour. Magnolia and Finn scrubbing surfaces, while Ruby May organized the chaos into manageable piles of garbage, donations, and things worth keeping. The physical work felt therapeutic, each cleaned surface a small victory in reclaiming her independence. You know what's funny? Magnolia said as she scrubbed beer stains from her coffee table. In New Zealand, I learned about the Maori concept of wakatahea, restoring balance after something sacred has been violated. I never thought I'd need to apply it to my own living room. But you're applying it, Finn observed, pausing in his work to look at her with the kind of focused attention that made her feel truly seen. You're not just cleaning. You're performing a ritual of reclamation. By sunset, the apartment was clean, but clearly damaged. The security deposit would be lost to floor refinishing and upholstery cleaning. Some things, like the trust that this space was truly her sanctuary, would take longer to restore. They sat on the porch behind the main house as the last light filtered through Spanish moss, sharing Ruby May's bourbon-glazed pork tenderloin and talking about next steps. For the first time in days, Magnolia felt like she could think clearly about the future, instead of just surviving the crisis. So, what happens now? Finn asked. With Jasper, I mean. He'll surface eventually, Ruby May said pragmatically. Boys like that always do when they run out of other people's money. Question is whether the family will be ready to handle him differently when he does. Magnolia's phone buzzed with a text from Beau. Delia is at home crying. She wants to talk to you when you're ready. No pressure. But I think she's finally seeing clearly. Mama wants to talk, Magnolia said, showing them the message. Are you ready for that conversation? Finn asked gently. I think so. But not at the family home where all the old dynamics live. If she wants to talk, she can come here, to my space, on my terms. Ruby May grinned approvingly. Look at you, setting boundaries like a grown woman who's learned something about her own worth. An hour later, Delia knocked tentatively on Magnolia's door, the first time in memory that her mother had visited her apartment. She looked smaller somehow, her perfect composure replaced by the raw vulnerability of someone whose worldview had been shattered. May I come in? She asked formally, as if unsure of her welcome. Of course. Magnolia stepped aside, noting how her mother's eyes took in the restored space with something like awe. You've made it beautiful, Delia said softly. I never really looked before. I just saw it as temporary, something you'd outgrow when you came to your senses about family obligations. It was never temporary for me. This apartment represents the first time in my life I felt like I had a space that was truly mine. Delia settled carefully on the cleaned sofa, her movements uncharacteristically hesitant. I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I know how to give. Start with the truth, Magnolia suggested, settling into the chair across from her mother. About what you knew and when you knew it. I knew Jasper was lying about some things, Delia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The business meetings that never seemed to involve actual business people. The way he avoided direct questions about his investor contacts. But I told myself that if I just believed in him hard enough, if I just supported him through this rough patch, he would magically transform into the son you wanted him to be. Delia's laugh was bitter. When you put it that way, it sounds ridiculous. But yes, that's exactly what I thought. I believed that family love could overcome addiction, that loyalty could cure character flaws, that if I just tried hard enough, I could save him from himself. At the expense of everyone else in the family? I never meant for it to get this far. Tears were flowing freely now, destroying Delia's carefully maintained composure. I never meant for him to hurt you or violate your space or put Beau's properties at risk. I couldn't bear the thought of giving up on my baby. Magnolia felt her own eyes filling with tears. Not just for her own pain, but for her mother's anguish at finally seeing the truth about her enabling behavior. Mama, you didn't give up on Jasper. You gave up on consequences. You gave up on boundaries. You gave up on the idea that love sometimes means saying no. She leaned forward, taking her mother's hands. But it's not too late to start loving him in a healthier way. How? Delia's voice was broken. How do I show love to a son who's stolen from his family, violated his sister's home, and disappeared rather than face what he's done? By not bailing him out when he surfaces, by not making excuses for his behavior, by insisting that he get real help for his addiction instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Delia was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Magnolia was suggesting. You're asking me to let him hit bottom. I'm asking you to stop cushioning his fall so he never has to learn to stand on his own. Magnolia thought about the Maori healing practices she'd learned, how some wounds needed to be fully felt before they could properly heal. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destruction. What if he gets arrested? What if he goes to prison? Then maybe he'll finally get the kind of structured environment where he can address his addiction without family members enabling him to avoid consequences. Delia sobbed quietly, the sound carrying years of suppressed fear and guilt. I've been so focused on protecting him that I stopped protecting everyone else, including you. Yes, Magnolia said simply. You did. How do I make this right? You start by supporting my independence instead of seeing it as a betrayal of family loyalty. You acknowledge that Beau's legal and financial advice comes from love, not jealousy. And when Jasper surfaces, you let him face the consequences of his choices instead of rushing in to save him. Can you forgive me? Magnolia considered the question seriously. Forgiveness wasn't a simple yes or no. It was a process that would require ongoing changes in behavior, not just apologies. For past harm, I can forgive you if you can change, she said finally. If you can learn to love without controlling, to support without enabling, to be a mother without sacrificing everyone else to save one child. Delia nodded through her tears. I want to try. I want to learn how to be better. Then start by going home and talking honestly with Beau about the financial situation. Start by visiting Meemaw and really listening to what she's been trying to tell you. Start by accepting that Jasper's addiction is a disease that requires professional treatment, not family management. As her mother prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Magnolia, your New Zealand experience. Did it really change you as much as it seemed to? It taught me that I could trust my own judgment, that I could build a life based on my values instead of other people's expectations. It taught me that love shouldn't require sacrifice of your authentic self. I'm proud of you, Delia said, softly. I should have said that months ago when you got the fellowship. I should have celebrated your independence instead of resenting it. You can say it now. That's what matters. After her mother left, Magnolia sat alone in her reclaimed space, feeling the weight of the day settling into something like peace. The apartment still bore scars from Jasper's occupation, but it was hers again. Her family was finally facing truth instead of living in denial. And for the first time since returning to Savannah, she felt like she could breathe freely in her own life. The Spanish moss swayed outside her windows, ancient and enduring, witness to countless family dramas and recoveries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they all learned to live with honesty instead of comfortable lies. But tonight, she was home in every sense of the word, physically, emotionally, and spiritually reclaimed. The hardest conversations were over. Now came the longer work of rebuilding relationships on foundations of truth rather than manipulation. But as she settled into her restored space, Magnolia felt ready for that challenge. The woman who had learned to heal others was finally learning to protect herself, and the balance felt exactly right. I've been going to GA meetings, Gamblers Anonymous, in the basement of St. John's Episcopal. The admission surprised her. Jasper had spent years denying he had a gambling problem, insisting his poker games were just recreational, just a way to blow off steam. What changed your mind? Sitting in that truck at 3 in the morning, realizing that I destroyed every relationship that ever mattered to me for the chance to chase one more bet. One more big win that was going to solve all my problems. His laugh was bitter. I finally understood that the problem wasn't bad luck or timing. The problem was me. Magnolia settled into her chair, maintaining physical distance while trying to assess whether this apparent transformation was genuine. Years of family manipulation had taught her to be skeptical of Jasper's dramatic revelations. What kind of help are you asking for? I need treatment. Real treatment. Not just meetings. There's a residential facility in Atlanta that specializes in gambling addiction. 30 days inpatient, followed by 6 months of intensive outpatient therapy. He pulled a crumpled brochure from his jacket pocket. I've already called them. They have a spot available next week. How are you planning to pay for it? I'm not. His voice was steady, resigned. I'm hoping Bo might be willing to loan me the money, but only if you and Mama agree that it's a good idea. I know I have no right to ask for anything from this family after what I've done. The admission that he couldn't pay for his own treatment was humbling in a way that Magnolia had never seen from her brother. Jasper had always had schemes, angles, ways to avoid accepting help that came with strings or accountability. What? About the gambling debts? The money you owe around town? I'm working with a debt counselor through GA to set up payment plans. It'll take me years to pay everyone back, but I want to do it. I want to make actual amends, not just apologies. Magnolia was quiet for a moment, processing the apparent sincerity of his request. Jasper, you've made grand promises before. You've had revelations and fresh starts and new plans. How is this different? Because this time I'm not asking you to believe me, he said simply. I'm asking you to let me prove it through actions, over time, with no expectation that you'll trust me until I've earned it back. The distinction was important, and it suggested a level of self-awareness that was genuinely new. Previous versions of Jasper's redemption stories had always included demands for immediate forgiveness and trust, emotional manipulation designed to shortcut the hard work of actual change. What about the criminal charges? The forgery, the mail theft, the fraud? Jasper's face went pale. Judge Pemberton called me yesterday. He said the family has to decide whether to press charges, but that the evidence is overwhelming if you choose to pursue it. And I told him I'd turn myself in if that's what you all decide. I can't keep running from consequences. It's what got me into this mess in the first place. Magnolia felt something shifting in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that the person sitting across from her might finally be taking genuine responsibility for his actions. I need to think about it, she said, and I need to talk to Mama and Bo and Meemaw. This isn't just my decision to make. I understand. He hesitated, then pulled an envelope from his jacket. I wrote you a letter. A real apology, not just words. You don't have to read it now, but I wanted you to have it. The envelope was addressed in Jasper's handwriting to Magnolia Beauregard, with no cute nickname, no casual familiarity. Even that small gesture suggested a new understanding of boundaries. There's something else, Jasper said as he prepared to leave. I've been talking to people in GA about family recovery, about how addiction affects everyone, not just the addict. They have programs for family members too. to help deal with the damage that enabling and codependency cause. You're suggesting Mama needs therapy? I'm suggesting we all do. This family has been sick for a long time, and it's not fair to expect everyone to just go back to normal because I'm finally getting help. The insight was so unexpected, so contrary to Jasper's usual self-centered worldview, that Magnolia found herself genuinely hopeful for the first time since his return. I'll talk to everyone, she promised. But Jasper, if you're running another con, if this is just a more sophisticated manipulation, then you'll know and you'll act accordingly, he finished. I'm not asking for trust I haven't earned. I'm just asking for the chance to try earning it. After he left, Magnolia sat with his letter unopened while her teenagers arrived for the art therapy workshop. The timing felt synchronous, helping other young people work through family trauma and identity issues while processing her own family's tentative steps toward healing. The workshop went beautifully. 6 teenagers from various backgrounds, all dealing with family dysfunction, addiction, or cultural identity struggles. Using techniques she'd learned in New Zealand, Magnolia guided them through creating artistic representations of their authentic selves versus the selves their families expected them to be. Sometimes honoring your family means becoming who you really are, not who they want you to be, she told the group as they worked. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in patterns that hurt everyone. One of the teenagers, a 17-year-old named Marcus, whose father struggled with alcoholism, looked up from his mixed media collage. But what if helping them means hurting yourself? Then you have to ask whether you're really helping them or just enabling them to avoid facing their problems, Magnolia replied, thinking of her own recent experiences. Love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. As the workshop ended and the teenagers departed with plans to meet again the following week, Magnolia felt a deep sense of purpose settling into place. The integration of her New Zealand training with her Savannah roots was working exactly as she'd hoped, creating something new that honored both experiences without being limited by either. That evening, Finn arrived with takeout from Ruby May's catering business and news about his documentary project. The Savannah Historical Society wants to feature your work in their next newsletter, he said, settling onto her restored sofa, with containers of Ruby May's famous low country boil. Apparently word is spreading about your cross-cultural art therapy approach. That's wonderful, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of attention yet. Why not? Magnolia thought about the question seriously. Because I want to make sure what I'm doing is sustainable, that it's coming from genuine integration, rather than just novelty. I don't want to be the person who went to New Zealand and came back with superficial cultural appropriation disguised as healing. Finn nodded approvingly. That kind of self-reflection is exactly why your work is genuine. You're not just importing techniques, you're creating something new that respects both traditions. They talked late into the evening about family healing, about the difference between forgiveness and trust, about the possibility that Jasper's apparent transformation might be real. When Finn finally left for his River Street apartment, Magnolia sat alone with her brother's letter. The handwriting was neater than usual, as if he'd taken special care with every word. Magnolia, I don't know how to apologize for what I've done to you, to our family, to the trust you placed in me when you gave me your keys. I could list all my actions and try to explain them, but explanations aren't the same as accountability, and I've spent too many years confusing the two. I stole your apartment because I was running from gambling debts and thought I deserved an easy solution. I manipulated Mama and Bo because I knew they'd enable me if I framed my needs as family loyalty. I used Mima's stroke as emotional leverage because I'm skilled at turning other people's pain into weapons for my own benefit. I am an addict, and I have been lying to myself and everyone else about that reality for years. The cost of those lies has been your trust, Mama's financial security, Bo's peace of mind, and Mima's voice in her own family. I can't undo any of that. But I can promise that I'm finally ready to do the work of becoming someone worthy of the family name I've dishonored. Whether you choose to be part of that process is entirely up to you, and I'll respect whatever boundaries you need to protect yourself. I love you, and I'm sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I finally understand what my choices have cost everyone I claim to care about. Your brother, if you'll still claim me, Jasper. Magnolia read the letter, twice, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. Instead, she found what seemed like genuine remorse and accountability. Not promises about who he'd become, but acknowledgement of who he'd been. The Spanish moss swayed outside her windows, ancient witness to countless family dramas and recoveries. Tomorrow she would call Beau and Judge Pemberton to discuss next steps. She would talk to her mother about family therapy and healthy boundaries. She would continue building the life that integrated all parts of herself. The Savannah daughter, the independent woman, the healer, who'd learned to protect herself while helping others. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, she felt genuinely hopeful about the possibility that her family might learn to love each other without destroying themselves in the process. The foundation was shaky, built on years of dysfunction and enabling. But foundations could be rebuilt, one honest conversation at a time. The hardest work was just beginning. But as she settled into her reclaimed space, surrounded by evidence of her own growth and healing, Magnolia felt ready for that challenge. The woman who had learned to stand on her own was finally ready to help her family learn to do the same. 6 months had passed since the confrontation that shattered her family's carefully constructed denial, and Magnolia found herself walking up the steps of the Chatham County Courthouse on a crisp January morning. The Spanish moss hung still in the winter air, and her breath formed small clouds as she paused outside the imposing neoclassical building that would serve as the final stage for her family's legal reckoning. Jasper had successfully completed his 30-day residential treatment program and was now 4 months into intensive outpatient therapy. More importantly, he'd kept his promise to make amends through actions rather than words. He'd gotten a job at a downtown restaurant, moved into a supervised living facility for people in recovery, and had been methodically paying back his gambling debts with the help of a financial counselor. The civil hearing today would determine restitution for the damage to Magnolia's apartment and the fraudulent use of family resources. But more significantly, it would provide formal closure to a family crisis that had forced all of them to examine the difference between love and enabling, between support and codependency. Magnolia wore a navy dress that struck the right balance between respectful formality and personal authenticity, professional enough for court, but flowing enough to feel like herself. The hand-woven Maori bracelet on her wrist served as a reminder of the strength she'd discovered during her time away, and the vintage pearls at her throat connected her to generations of Beauregard women who had survived their own family crises. Inside the courthouse, she found her family already assembled. In the corridor outside the hearing room, Delia sat straight-backed on a wooden bench, her composure restored but somehow softer than the steel Magnolia performance of months past. Family therapy had taught her to love without controlling, and the change was visible in everything from her posture to the way she looked at Jasper without the desperate intensity of someone trying to save him from himself. Beau stood nearby, his expression calm but attentive. The financial crisis had been resolved through a combination of careful bankruptcy proceedings, property sales, and payment plans that would keep the family home while eliminating the crushing debt Jasper's behavior had accumulated. More importantly, he'd learned to support his wife's healing without enabling her enabling. Meemaw sat in her wheelchair, her speech much improved after months of therapy, her sharp eyes taking in every detail with the satisfaction of someone whose warnings had finally been heard. Her role as family truth-teller had been officially acknowledged, and her relationship with Magnolia had deepened into something approaching co-conspiracy against future family dysfunction. Jasper sat slightly apart from the others, not in shame, but in the kind of respectful distance that acknowledged the ongoing work of rebuilding trust. He wore a simple suit and tie, his appearance neat but not polished to the point of performance. The desperate charm that had characterized his earlier manipulations had been replaced by something quieter and more genuine. Ruby May and Finn flanked Magnolia as her chosen family support system, their presence serving as a reminder that she'd built a life beyond blood relationships that couldn't be manipulated or weaponized against her autonomy. "You ready for this?" Ruby May asked, squeezing Magnolia's hand with warm strength. "As ready as anyone can be to testify about family dysfunction in open court," Magnolia replied with dry humor that hadn't been available to her 6 months earlier. Judge Pemberton entered the hearing room with the same quiet authority that had cut through family manipulation during their private meeting. But in his official role, his presence carried even more weight, the full power of legal consequences that couldn't be charmed, manipulated, or avoided through family loyalty appeals. The proceedings began with Toby Mitchell presenting the documented evidence of property damage forged signatures, and fraudulent business activities. The facts were laid out with clinical precision, each piece of evidence building a case that was legally overwhelming and emotionally devastating. "Your Honor," Toby said, "Ms. Beauregard is seeking restitution for property damage in the amount of $4,000, covering floor refinishing, upholstery cleaning, and security deposit forfeiture. Additionally, she's requesting acknowledgement of the emotional distress caused by the violation of her home and the systematic manipulation that enabled that violation." When called to testify, Magnolia took the witness stand with steady composure, her art therapy training helping her present the facts without being overwhelmed by the emotions they carried. "Ms. Beauregard," Judge Pemberton said gently, "please tell the court about the impact of your brother's actions on your life and your sense of security." "Your Honor, when I returned from my fellowship in New Zealand, I found that my apartment, which represented my first independent adult space, had been violated and damaged. But more significantly, I discovered that my family had been manipulated into believing that my absence during a family medical crisis justified that violation." She spoke clearly about the gaslighting, the weaponization of family loyalty, the way her professional growth had been reframed as selfish abandonment. Her voice remained steady as she described the systematic manipulation that had left her questioning her own perceptions and judgment. "The damage to my apartment was significant, but the damage to my relationship with my family and my trust in my own perceptions was more serious. I spent weeks wondering whether I really had been selfish, whether I really had abandoned my family when they needed me most." "And what helped you understand that your perceptions were accurate?" "The support of friends who weren't invested in family mythology, legal advice that clarified my rights, and eventually, documentation provided by my grandmother showing that the crisis had been deliberately exaggerated, and my brother's caretaking role had been largely fabricated." When it was Jasper's turn to testify, he approached the witness stand with none of his former swagger. His voice was quiet but clear, as he accepted full responsibility for his actions. "Your Honor, I violated my sister's trust, her home, and her right to feel secure in her own space. I manipulated my family's love for me into permission to avoid consequences for my gambling addiction. I forged signatures, intercepted mail, and created false business documents to support investment fraud." Judge Pemberton studied Jasper with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate genuine remorse versus performance. "Mr. Beauregard, what has changed in your understanding of your actions?" "I understand now that addiction doesn't excuse harm to others, and that family love isn't a shield against accountability. I spent years believing that if my motivations came from desperation, rather than malice, the damage I caused somehow mattered less. I was wrong. What steps have you taken to address the harm you've caused?" "I've completed residential treatment for gambling addiction and am continuing with outpatient therapy. I've obtained employment and am making restitution payments to all my creditors, including the money I owe for damages to my sister's apartment. Most importantly, I've stopped asking my family to save me from the consequences of my choices." The most powerful testimony came from Meemaw, whose speech had improved enough to allow her to speak clearly about the years of family dysfunction she'd witnessed and tried to warn against. "Your Honor," she said in her still careful but determined voice, "I watched this family enable destructive behavior for years because we confused love with rescue. We taught Jasper that family loyalty meant he could escape consequences. And we taught Magnolia that her independence was a betrayal of family values. Mrs. Beauregard, what would you like to see come from these proceedings?" "I want my family to learn the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. I want Magnolia to know that her grandmother values her courage in standing up for herself. And I want Jasper to understand that real family love sometimes means refusing to participate in someone's self-destruction." When Delia testified, her composure was different from the steel Magnolia performance that had characterized her earlier family management. Her voice carried genuine remorse rather than defensive justification. "Your Honor, I enabled my son's destructive behavior because I was terrified of losing him. In trying to save him from consequences, I taught him that his addiction was everyone's problem except his own. I hurt my daughter, my husband, and ultimately my son by refusing to let him face the reality of his choices." "What has changed in your approach to family relationships?" I've learned that love sometimes means saying no. That supporting my children means respecting their autonomy rather than managing their lives. And that family loyalty doesn't require sacrificing individual truth for group harmony. Judge Pemberton's ruling was delivered with the kind of measured authority that gave weight to both justice and mercy. Mr. Beauregard, you will pay full restitution of $4,000 to your sister for property damage. You will continue with your addiction treatment and comply with all terms of your recovery program. Most importantly, you will have no contact with your sister's residence without her explicit permission. However, he continued, the court acknowledges the genuine effort you've made toward accountability and recovery. The family's choice not to pursue criminal charges reflects their commitment to healing rather than punishment, and the court respects that decision. Ms. Beauregard, your courage in standing up for your rights while maintaining compassion for your family's healing process demonstrates the kind of wisdom that transforms family dysfunction into family growth. The court hopes this resolution allows all parties to move forward with healthier relationships. As they left the courthouse, Magnolia felt a sense of completion that went beyond legal resolution. The confident woman who had spent 6 months learning to heal others had finally learned to protect herself while maintaining love for family members who had hurt her. The family gathered for lunch at a restaurant near the courthouse, not a celebration, but a quiet acknowledgement that they had all survived a crisis that could have destroyed them. The conversation was careful, but genuine, marked by the kind of authentic care that was possible when people stopped performing roles and started being real. I'm proud of you, Delia said quietly to Magnolia as they prepared to part ways. For standing up for yourself, for getting us all help, whether we wanted it or not, for showing us what. The January evening was crisp but not cold, and the live oaks surrounding the historic mansion were strung with tiny white lights that made the Spanish moss look like something from a fairy tale. Inside, the main gallery space had been transformed into a showcase of cross-cultural healing through art. Her own pieces, mixed media works that incorporated both Maori weaving techniques and Southern textile traditions, hung alongside artwork created by her teen therapy groups, adult clients, working through family trauma, and even some pieces by family members who had engaged with her therapeutic process. Ruby May bustled through the space with her catering team, arranging elegant Southern hors d'oeuvres with modern presentations that perfectly captured the evening's theme of honoring tradition while creating something new. Her friend had insisted on donating her services for the opening, claiming it was about time Savannah saw what real healing work looks like. 5 minutes to opening, Finn called from his position near the entrance, where he was adjusting the lighting on a video display featuring interviews with some of Magnolia's clients about their healing processes. His documentary about Southern historic preservation had evolved to include a segment about cultural healing traditions, with Magnolia's work serving as a bridge between academic preservation and living, breathing cultural evolution. Magnolia smoothed her dress, a flowing emerald silk that she'd chosen because it made her feel both elegant and authentically herself, and took a moment to center herself before the crowd arrived. The Maori breathing techniques she'd learned in Wellington still served her well during moments of transition and significance. The first guests to arrive were her teenagers from the ongoing art therapy groups, dressed in their carefully chosen best clothes and radiating the kind of nervous excitement that came from seeing their work displayed in a real gallery. Marcus, the 17-year-old whose father struggled with alcoholism, stood proudly beside his mixed media piece about the self I'm becoming versus the self my family expects. Ms. Magnolia, he said, using the respectful address that had become standard among her young clients. My mom's bringing my whole extended family tonight. She says this is the first time she's ever seen my attitude problem turn into something beautiful. Magnolia felt the familiar warmth that came from witnessing young people discover their own capacity for growth and self-expression. Your attitude wasn't the problem, Marcus. Your family's inability to see your authentic self was the problem. You just learned how to show them who you really are in a way they could finally understand. As the gallery filled with guests, Magnolia moved through the space with gracious ease, discussing her work with visitors while keeping one eye on the entrance for her family's arrival. They had promised to come, but family events still carried complicated emotional weight, despite the progress they'd all made. Mima arrived first, wheeled in by a home health aide but insisting on navigating the gallery space independently once inside. Her speech had continued to improve, and her role as family truth-teller had evolved into something approaching family wisdom keeper. She wore her best pearls and the kind of satisfied expression that came from watching a granddaughter succeed, on her own terms. "Child," she said, gripping Magnolia's hand with surprising strength. "This is what I always knew you could do if the family would just get out of your way long enough to let you grow." Bo and Delia arrived together, their body language reflecting the healthier dynamic they'd developed through months of family therapy. Delia had learned to support without controlling, and Bo had learned to speak up for justice without avoiding family conflict. They moved through the gallery with genuine interest, reading wall texts and engaging with other guests in conversations about art and healing. "I had no idea," Delia murmured, as she stood before one of Magnolia's largest pieces, a textile work that incorporated family photographs, traditional Southern fabrics, and Maori-inspired patterns into a meditation on inherited trauma and chosen healing. "I never understood what you were actually doing. I thought art therapy was just crafts for people with problems." "Most people do," Magnolia replied gently. "But when you understand that creativity is connected to our deepest sense of self, that making something beautiful from pain is one of humanity's oldest healing traditions, it becomes much more significant." The evening's most meaningful moment came when Jasper arrived, punctual and appropriately dressed, carrying a small wrapped package. He'd been sober for 8 months now, employed for 6, and had completed every requirement of his restitution agreement ahead of schedule. More importantly, he'd learned to show up for family events without making them about his own drama or redemption narrative. "I brought you something," he said quietly, offering the package with none of his former performative charm. "It's not much, but I wanted to contribute something to tonight that wasn't about what I'd taken from you." Inside the wrapping was a small, framed photograph of their great-great-grandmother, the woman who had hidden the family silver during Sherman's March. But this wasn't the formal portrait that hung in the family home. This was a candid shot, showing her working in a garden, her sleeves rolled up and her expression determined rather than decorative. "I found it in Mima's papers when I was helping her organize her room," Jasper explained. "I thought you should have it. She looks like someone who understood that honoring family sometimes means breaking family patterns." Magnolia felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift and the understanding it represented. "Jasper, this is perfect. Thank you. I also wanted to tell you," he continued, "that watching you build this life, seeing how you integrate everything you've learned without losing yourself, it's helping me understand what healthy independence actually looks like." As the evening progressed, Judge Pemberton arrived with several members of the Savannah Historical Society, lending the kind of community authority that transformed Magnolia's work from interesting novelty to recognized professional contribution. Local therapists and social workers mingled with artists and cultural preservationists, creating conversations about the intersection of healing and creativity that would continue long after the gallery lights went down. The evening's culmination came when Finn stepped to the center of the gallery with a champagne flute, and the kind of nervous energy that suggested something significant was about to happen. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," he said, his Irish accent more pronounced with emotion. "I came to Savannah to document how communities preserve their heritage while adapting to change. What I found was something much more personal, a woman who embodies the very best of both preservation and evolution." He turned to face Magnolia directly, his expression carrying the weight of genuine love and respect. "Magnolia Beauregard, you've taught me that honoring the past doesn't mean being trapped by it, that healing others requires first learning to protect yourself, and that love grows stronger when it's based on truth rather than obligation." From his jacket pocket, he produced a small velvet box, and the gallery fell silent with anticipation. "I'm hoping you'll consider making our partnership permanent. Will you marry me?" The proposal was both completely surprising and perfectly inevitable. Finn represented everything she'd learned about healthy relationships: respect for her autonomy, appreciation for her growth, support without control. Their partnership had been built on mutual choice rather than family obligation, on shared values rather than shared dysfunction. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the gallery. "Absolutely yes. As applause erupted around them and Finn slipped the ring onto her finger, Magnolia felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had successfully integrated all aspects of her identity. The Savannah daughter, the independent woman, the healer, the partner. All of these roles could coexist without conflict when they were built on authentic choice rather than external expectations. Ruby May raised her champagne glass with the kind of triumphant grin that came from watching a friend claim her full power. To Magnolia, she announced, who taught her whole family that love doesn't require sacrifice of your authentic self. To integration, Mima added in her careful but clear voice. And to granddaughters who are brave enough to break cycles while honoring what's worth keeping. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave with promises to return for future exhibitions, Magnolia stood in the gallery surrounded by evidence of her own growth and her community's support. The artwork on the walls represented not just aesthetic achievement, but profound healing, her own and that of the clients who had trusted her with their stories. The Spanish moss swayed outside the gallery windows, ancient witness to countless transformations and renewals. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she and Finn planned their wedding, as her family continued their ongoing work of healthy relationship maintenance, as her practice expanded to serve more people seeking integration of their own fractured parts. But tonight was about celebration and completion of a journey that had begun with violation and displacement and ended with reclamation and expansion. The woman who had left for New Zealand seeking professional growth had returned with the wisdom to transform family dysfunction into family healing, personal trauma into community service. The cycle was complete, but not closed. Like the Spanish moss that renewed itself season after season while remaining rooted in ancient trees, Magnolia had learned to grow and change while staying connected to what truly mattered. The integration was not a destination, but an ongoing practice of choosing authenticity over performance, boundaries over enmeshment, and love that empowered rather than controlled. As she locked the gallery door and walked out into the Savannah night with Finn's hand warm in hers, Magnolia felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had successfully created a life that honored both her roots and her wings. The work would continue, but the foundation was solid. She was finally fully home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.